Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Yes, this program is based on the book, The Grand Eccentrics by Mark Bernstein. You can find this at your local library. I know you can find it at Books and Company, and you can also find it at the Carillon Park. So this is a fascinating read. He goes into a lot of detail, which I absolutely loved, and I'm going to share quite a few of those fascinating and fun details with you tonight. If you belong to another organization and you're interested in speaking engagements, I have a list of programs that I do. I also have a business card up here. And I am also a member of the Grafton Hill Neighborhood Association, which makes me the neighborhood liaison for Preservation Dayton. And I did put brochures up in the lobby about the Preservation Dayton Historic Walking Tour. So please grab one of those before you leave this evening. All right, so we're going to get started with John, Charles, James, Orville, and Wilbur. John Patterson. He took 4 baths a day. He wore underwear made from pool table felt. He slept with his head hanging on the side of the bed to avoid rebreathing his just exhaled breath. In 1902, his travels in Bulgaria, Patterson noticed that people ate a lot of paprika and that they had good teeth. So upon his return home, he had the NCR commissary order 4,000 pounds of the spice and applied it to everything that they served. Orville, he numbered the eggs the chicken had laid so that they could be eaten in order. He was mild-mannered and impish. He ignored authority. He was kind and sweet, and he was afraid of public speaking. Orville versus Wilbur. Orville was more imaginative, a better mathematician, and more optimistic. Wilbur was a more organized thinker. He had more drive and impulse to do something large. He played the public role and presented papers at scientific conferences. Charles. Swearing was his second language. By age 30, he was known as Boss Ket. He took out a $1.6 million life insurance policy naming Automotive Research as its beneficiary. He loved an audience and he loved to talk. When Kettering was introduced to Einstein, the physicist recognized the name and said, "Oh yes, the auto mechanic." That, of course, did not go over well with Kettering. He thought he had done much more than that. Governor Cox. In 1913, he pushed through legislation and signed into law more progressive legislation than any predecessor, and it included school reform, tax reform, prison reform, and a landmark workmen's compensation bill. Patterson. He was known as a fuss budget, never at rest, rarely at ease, jittery in movement, and usually rode a bicycle to work. He launched a relentless campaign against the city of his birth, spooned out malted milk to his employees, defeated many, terrified most, and died an honored philanthropist. After receiving a college degree, he returned home to Dayton and found himself unemployable. His degree disqualified him for physical work, and his lack of experience disqualified him for everything else. He took a job as a toll collector on the Miami-Erie Canal. Bored to death, he and his brother bought a coal yard. Soon, Patterson held half the coal business in Dayton and owned 3 mines near Coaltown, Ohio. The mine had a company store that was being robbed by its own clerks. He heard about an invention by James Ritty, known as the incorruptible bartender. And within 6 months of purchasing one of the machines, his store produced a $5,000 profit. Patterson failed out of the coal business and turned to the National Manufacturing Company, where in 1884, he paid $6,500 for control of Ritty's patents. Patterson was a visual guy and thought that people learned best when they saw something. And to that end, he and his aide stitched together some sheets, mounted them on an easel for better display, and with that, he invented the flip chart. He immediately set out to sell cash registers across the country. He changed the name of the company to the National Cash Register Company and printed 8 pieces of advertising literature, sent 6 letters a week for 3 weeks, launching the first ever direct mail advertising campaign. And who did he sell the first cash registers to? Saloon owners. Why? Well, a man walks into a bar, asks for a shot of whiskey, snorts it down, and lays a 50-cent piece on the counter and walks out. The bartender pockets the coin. then notices that the owner has been watching. Maintaining his calm, the bartender says, "Imagine that. The guy leaves a 50-cent tip when he can't even afford the drink he just had." Patterson sold just 359 registers the year he bought the company and sold 1,995 3 years later. Patterson was attentive to success and curious as to its causes. Joseph H. Crane was Patterson's brother-in-law, and before joining NCR, Crane was known as the best wallpaper salesman in the state, but he couldn't sell cash registers, and that was until he placed his talks in a logical order and repeated it word for word to each customer. It was the first canned spiel. And these spiels, while reviled by the sales force at first, would later become the tool to create the corporate representative, another invention of Patterson. Manners and appearance were a must. Patterson opened the nation's first sales training program in 1894. And Patterson was a tyrant when it came to his sales force and was very controlling. All sales were made by men. He told them how to dress, how to act, what to say, when to say it. He even organized their wives with a banner made especially for them about expectations of an NCR salesman. Imagine receiving that from your husband's boss. When a bunch of cash registers were returned from England as defective, Patterson moved his desk to the factory floor to find out why. What he found was a disenfranchised workforce. When he asked what was wrong, he got an earful and then some. So what did he do? He increased wages, cleaned up the production floor by removing dirt and debris, shielded dangerous equipment, installed fans to remove the metal dust from the grinding area. All employees received a locker. Free showers were made available, along with free brushes and combs. He opened a company cafeteria, serving hot lunches for a nickel. He opened a medical dispensary, and a dental unit followed. Women were given umbrellas to shield themselves from rain, lest they get sick. To combat malnutrition, he had each employee weighed every 6 months. Those found underweight were given free malted milk each morning. Patterson believed that better working conditions returned more in raised productivity and higher quality than they cost to create. Patterson said, "The first step towards self-respect is decent living and working conditions. A man cannot come out of a hovel, have a dirty breakfast, go into a dark, noisome factory, and then do a good day's work." Patterson then commissioned industrial architect Frank Andrews to design a series of glass factories which allowed most work to be done in natural light. He then hired the landscaping firm headed by Frank Law Olmsted, designer of New York's Central Park, to lay out the factory grounds. NCR established a night school, a free lending library, and built a 2,000-seat schoolhouse auditorium. In 1895, he instituted the suggestion system with cash prizes to those who contributed ideas useful to the company. NCR sat in the neighborhood that was known as Slidertown, supposedly named because all that failed in Dayton eventually slid there. Rock-throwing boys in the neighborhood loved the glass factory and its many wide windows. Patterson started a neighborhood boys club that eventually was open to all children, and he gave idle hands the grounds, the tools, and the instruction for a garden. If the boys spent 2 years with the garden, they graduated with a certificate to the Boys Box Furniture Company, where the boys then made birdhouses, footstools, and other objects out of discarded packing crates. While in Dayton, John C. Olmsted, who designed a few model yards, showed Patterson how to inexpensively revive a rundown property. Patterson used cash as an incentive, annual prizes for best premises, window boxes, vine planting, and landscaping, and it all worked brilliantly. In 1899, NCR was operating Dayton's first kindergarten, a Sunday school, a saving bank for children, playgrounds, cooking and sewing classes for girls and women, and a girls and boys club. Additional activities included dance school, an auto harp society, and the all-janitor glee club. By the close of the century, Patterson's employees were among the best treated in America, paid well, working in safe conditions, and with an extensive list of benefits to choose from. James Cox. He was a lot of things, as you can see. a farmer, a teacher, governor, presidential candidate. The newspaper changed when producing paper became cheaper, and so did the stories. Flamboyant journalism built large circulations, and large circulations built big business. In 1898, with the help of his former employer, he received the money to purchase the Daily News, but not as the sole owner. He bullied Dr. John E. Lowes every day in 4-column-wide editorials that ran on page 1. Lowes filed a libel suit. Cox pleaded guilty to libeling Dr. Lowes and paid a fine of just $1. The attack on Lowes helped make the Daily News the local newspaper to read. And for Cox, challenging authority was good business and risky enough to be interesting. In 1900, just 2 years after the start of the paper, he bought out the original investors. Wilbur. On May 3, 1900, in a letter to Octave Chanute, Wilbur wrote, "For some years I have been afflicted with the belief that flight is possible to man. But there were plenty of naysayers, including writer H.G. Wells, who said an aircraft wouldn't fly and return its operator safely to Earth probably before 1950. It took the Wrights 55 months working part-time to create powered flight." Still in correspondence with Chanute, Wilbur wrote, "I make no secret of my plans for the reason of the first flying machine, and that only those who are willing to give, as well as to receive suggestions, can hope to link their names with the honor of discovering. The problem is too great for one man alone and unaided to solve in secret." Orville had to help. Each was a logical thinker and aided each other as a sparring partner. Wilbur said of his brother, "I like Orville. Orville likes a good scrap." Often they were referred to as a pair of bicycle makers from Dayton, Ohio. But these bicycle makers understood balance, and Orville concluded that for a plane to fly, it must be able to correct its course and keep its balance. The Wrights were drawn to Kitty Hawk for its combination of wind for lift and sand for a soft landing. In 1901, the pair were harassed by swarms of mosquitoes. Orville wrote home that the wind had stopped blowing and there was nothing to do but take refuge under the blankets from the pesky bugs. The bugs were so bad that the brothers wrapped themselves in blankets, only allowing their noses to protrude out. The heat became so unbearable, but they didn't dare expose any more skin. "Misery, misery," wrote Orville. John T. Daniels took the most famous amateur photograph ever, the moment at which Orville Wright left the ground on man's first powered and controlled flight. Charles. Kettering was born in 1876, 60 miles northeast of Columbus, Ohio. He was the fourth of 5 children. They were poor. He called himself, with pride, a hillbilly. And by age 19, he was a teacher at the county school 5 miles from home. He left his classroom to study electrical engineering at Ohio State University, only to leave when his eyesight could not keep up with the amount of study. He ended up in Ashland, Ohio, working for the Star Telephone Company. There he met and courted Olive Williams, a postmaster's daughter. Kettering returned to Ohio State in 1901 and graduated in 1904. He was recommended as a graduating senior for technical employment with a firm in Dayton, Ohio. Encouraged by his physics professor, Charles went to Dayton to visit National Cash Register, where he met Edward Deeds. In 1904, he signed on as a member of the Inventions Department at a salary of $50 a week. Kettering's major achievement at NCR was the invention of the electric cash register. He spent 5 years at NCR, acquiring 23 patents. He married Olive Williams on August 1st, 1905, and on their way to their honeymoon in Niagara Falls, and while waiting to change trains in Crestline, Ohio, Kettering saw a man trying to start an automobile. Kettering offered his assistance and immediately saw the problem: loose wiring in the ignition. He set it right and was rewarded with a ride about town. It was Charles Kettering's first ride in an automobile. Back to Patterson and firings. Patterson was an absolute genius regarding them. One NCR executive found his desk and chair on the company lawn set ablaze. And once, unhappy with the accounting department, he marched them to the boiler room with ledgers in hand, only to be thrown in the fire and the entire department dismissed. Patterson said, "When a man gets indispensable, let's fire him." It was once reported that between 1910 and 1930, 1/6 of the nation's top executives have been trained and fired by Patterson, including Thomas J. Watson of IBM. A few, such as Edward Deeds and Stanley Allen, caught Patterson's eye, and they rose to the highest ranks within the company. But there was a downside. Executives received instructions from Patterson such as the recommended widths of their ties, the recommended percentage they leave as a tip, and the recommended leisure pursuits for them and their families. Allen said that upon returning from business trips, Patterson had dumped the contents of his desk in the trash. That was a signal to the executives to start cleaning house, and firings often followed. Patterson regarded himself as Dayton's leading citizen. However, the city's corrupt government kept ignoring all his counsel and advice. He once told them that all cats and dogs should be banned from Dayton as agents of pestilence. Not always right, Patterson was right on several points. Local government needed reformed, the canal was a stagnant mess, and cultural amenities were lacking. The city did worse. They spurned his generosity, including turning down his offer of 120 acres for a public park. Patterson being Patterson, he did let them know of his ire. In an assembly at the NCR auditorium, he gave them a 2.5-hour tongue lashing, told them that Dayton was the worst city in the state and that it turned out more criminals than any other city. He denounced their leadership. He pointed fingers and called both city and other local businessmen out. He told them that they were lacking in civic mindedness and were too tolerant of corruption. Dayton, Patterson proclaimed, had failed its heritage. He threatened to leave Dayton and take NCR and its 3,800 jobs with him. In a second speech, he talked of how he was ridiculed for his employee welfare system, his proposals for civic improvement, his urgings on health and diet. He added, NCR's departure will be the best thing ever to happen to Dayton. One local newspaper headline read, if the National Cash Register Company leaves Dayton, it will be because the people of the city have driven it away. Patterson versus Cox. James Cox in the Dayton Daily News responded with an advertisement of ridicule and disrespect, which backfired tenfold. Patterson's response, he sued Cox in a multitude of lawsuits. Cox and Patterson feuded back and forth, Cox publicly in his newspaper, and Patterson with his libel lawsuits totaling well over $1 million. Cox did not have the money and his bank credit did not go far, but in a twist of fate during deposition, questions of Patterson making gifts to a judge and to labor officials left Patterson to stop the questioning, drop the lawsuits, and pay all of Cox's legal fees. Patterson left Dayton and managed NCR from New York City for the next 3 years. In 1908, when Cox ran for Congress, Patterson endorsed him. Patterson versus Kettering. Patterson made all the NCR executives ride horses. He made them get up at dawn and ride, whether they could or not, including Charles Kettering, who was no horseman. Patterson said a man who could not command his horse ought to be fired, and Charles was, only to be rehired by Edward Deeds. Patterson did not like Charles Kettering. In fact, he hated him. But for some reason, there was always a revolving door for Kettering, and each time he was fired by Patterson, he was brought back by Deeds. In 1908, Deeds and Kettering began moonlighting in Deeds' barn. The first project the pair worked on was the unreliable ignition system of the automobile. Kettering designed a stationary coil that concentrated the spark, providing discrete jolts of electricity timed to each compression of the cylinder. Joining the barn gang were William Christ and William Anderson. Deeds approached Henry Leland, president of Cadillac. His standards in automaking surpassed all others, and in July of 1909, Leland placed an order for 8,000 of Kettering's new system. With no production facility, no financing, no papers of incorporation, and not even a name for their partnership, Deeds and Kettering were caught off guard. They were interested in development, not manufacturing, so they subcontracted the entire production run and incorporated their efforts as the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, also known as Delco. Kettering hated the name, but Bill Christ, who liked the way the National Biscuit Company turned out Nabisco, thought Delco sounded pleasant. And on September 1st, 1909, Kettering resigned from NCR. Now to the Wright brothers. While in Europe in 1907, Wilbur wrote to Catherine from Berlin that while he and Orville were taking an evening walk, they came upon a cash register office. He said that they saw people playing with the machines as though it were a toy piano. In 1908, the brothers separated, Wilbur in France and Orville in America. They were trying to sell their airplane to any government. On August 8th of 1908 in France, Wilbur took to the skies. His flight lasted all of 2 minutes. French aviators were stunned. The crowds that gathered wept, jumped in place, and hugged each other. Back in America, in Fort Myer, Virginia, Orville began flying on September 3rd. Onlookers became incoherent. One was reported as repeating over and over, "My God, my God, my God." And on September 9th, Orville flew for 62 minutes, a world endurance mark. He and Wilbur, still in France, would swap records for longest and highest flight many times over. On September 17, 1908, the first death occurred when Orville and Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge took off. The aircraft lost thrust and Orville couldn't recover. The plane crashed. Both he and Selfridge were knocked unconscious. Selfridge died later that day, and Orville sustained a broken leg, several cracked ribs, and a permanent back injury. James Cox. In the summer of 1908, Cox declared his candidacy for Congress, and he won the 3rd District seat at the age of 38. He was a progressive. He supported efforts to reform the House, was in favor of free trade, introduced legislation to regulate the employment of children in the District of Columbia, and backed the reform of railway rates. Wilbur? On May 2nd, 1912, Wilbur complained of a temperature. 4 weeks later, he was dead from typhoid fever. Tributes poured in, the cash registers fell silent, and for 90 minutes surrounding Wilbur Wright's interment, all retail business in Dayton ceased, and for a briefer period, streetcars came to a rest. Pallbearers included 2 from the Wright Company, 2 from the Dayton Aero Club, and 2 from the annual club of the 10 Dayton Boys. Honorary pallbearer was James M. Cox. In his first term in Congress, Cox secured for Dayton, namely the National Soldiers' Home, a private pension bill to grant or extend the pension rights of individuals, and a new post office. These 2 items all but secured his re-election in 1910, and he was voted in with a healthy 12,000 vote margin. Ohio's existing constitution so limited the power of government that the state was unable to govern effectively. Ohio had no power to regulate wages and hours or compensate injured workmen. Ohio had no authority to inspect banks or ban the sale of fraudulent securities. Municipal governments lacked broad powers. The state was being shortchanged on tax collections. Then, taxes were set in each township by a locally or elected assessor. You can see where a person's re-election may have been determined by what he didn't collect. Ohio's progressives held that only a more powerful state government, directed by a strong executive, could provide Ohio citizens with a government appropriate for the time. And timing is everything. Under the Ohio Constitution, the electorate had the option each 20 years of calling a state constitutional convention. Placed before the voters were 42 proposed constitutional amendments, including amendments that would grant the state authority over hours and wages, over banks, securities, and insurance companies, establish judicial reforms, enact women's suffrage, set conservation measures, and abolish capital punishment. Cox was still a congressman, but campaigned statewide on behalf of the amendments. By the time the amendments' special election, the people of Ohio approved 34 of the 42 proposals. And when Ohio Democrats met in convention, Cox's nomination was unopposed. The Republicans split their vote with a third-party candidate, and Cox won the governorship with 42% of the vote. Cox was never personally popular in Dayton, but they did admire him as a successful man. The day after his inauguration, Cox gave the state legislators a detailed package of 56 proposed reforms. Here are just some of them. And within 3 months, all 56 had been voted into law. In the area of workmen's compensation, he took the lead, and with careful thought and consideration, he wrote the workmen's compensation law that became the nation's standard. Behind his tough demeanor, Cox was a sentimentalist. His three most prideful achievements to him were workmen's compensation, school reform, and prison reform. Back to John Patterson. Fall 1912, Patterson's highly organized systems of production and marketing and sales had brought Patterson the bulk of the market for cash registers. In 1911, NCR rang up the sale of its 1 millionth machine. With only a few competitors remaining, Patterson had a system of eliminating them. As Patterson's salesmen pushed new and improved versions of the cash register, a growing secondhand market emerged. Patterson couldn't stand it that others were making money off the very machines that he had built. In 1903, he set up a dummy corporation, gave it $1 million budget, and focused on driving the independent secondhand dealer from the market. His organization opened its own secondhand stores and would undersell the competitor, harass the customers, and bribe the competitor's salesmen until the competitor gave up and accepted a buyout offer. Patterson also used his production lines to turn out knockout machines, crude reproductions of competing models, often bearing the competitor's nameplate, sold cheap and designed for failure. Patterson routinely filed lawsuits against the competition for alleged libels of his character or for intrusions of patents which NCR had on its products. If there was a lawsuit, Patterson used tactics to prolong the suit, costing the competitor more money before eventually giving up and settling on Patterson's terms. These tactics eventually landed Patterson in federal court, and on February 22nd of 1912, Patterson and 28 of high-ranking NCR executives were indicted on 3 counts of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, conspiring to create a monopoly, unlawfully monopolizing the trade in cash registers, and holding and carrying on a business created by a monopoly. Patterson, of course, proclaimed innocence. One friendly editorial for Patterson and NCR stated that he had committed no greater wrong than thousands of businessmen are guilty of every day and hour of their lives. It also stated that if NCR had done wrong, it had done so only in response to patent infringements perpetrated by the very same small fry who had now cried foul at the government's convenience. Defendant's testimony was not heard, and many doubted the government's motives in bringing the case. The jury, on February 13, 1913, returned verdicts of guilt on all counts against Patterson and all but one of his co-defendants. At sentencing, John H. Patterson received a $5,000 fine and a year in jail. Most of the others received a fine. Facing prison, Patterson needed a reversal on appeal or an act of God. Guess what he got? An act of God. Flooding in Dayton, March 1805, an extraordinary rise in the river filled water in the streets to canoe at first in St. Clair. January 2nd, 1847, the levee broke and ran for 16 blocks. February 1883, Ludlow Street had 22 inches of water. February 1886, flooding created pools deep enough to swim a horse. And then the rains began Easter weekend, and on Monday, March 24th, 1913, the floodgates of heaven opened wide. The winter season had seen 7 to 11 inches of rain, and most of the 3,500 square miles of the greater Miami Valley area has saturated ground with little runoff. On Tuesday, John H. Patterson inspected the levees of the south side of the river. He returned to NCR and called his executives to an emergency meeting. He told them that Dayton would soon be flooded. At 8:30, the levee began to break apart, and by noon, 12 to 14 feet of water were raging through downtown streets. By nightfall, 6 feet of water filled Orville Wright's home on Hawthorne Street. Orville found high ground and watched as buildings near his office on 3rd Street burned. The 1903 aircraft sat disassembled in packing crates behind his shop, and of greater concern was that in his office building's 2nd floor contained his and Wilbur's life work. And at the center of it all, John H. Patterson was coolly cantankerous in issuing orders to all. What set the 1913 flood apart from other disasters was the role played by private businessmen. Patterson's NCR sat on high ground south of town. It had its own supply of generators, its own supply of fresh water, and the only telegraph line still operating in the city. By 10 a.m. on Tuesday of the flood, the first of the NCR rowboats was launched. The boats were being made at one per every 8 minutes, and 275 made in total. Nearly 9,000 people were rescued. Those collected by NCR were taken to the factory. They were given dry clothes, served hot meals and beverages, examined by company medical personnel, and given a bed to sleep in nightly. An emergency hospital was set up on the 4th floor of the administration building. The first child born in the makeshift hospital was a boy named John H. for the NCR president, and the second baby, also a boy, was named Cash. The next day, Wednesday, Orville learned that the papers in his second-floor office had survived. Cox declared Dayton a disaster area and ordered in the National Guard. He secured emergency rescue and relief funds, obtained 1 million rations from the federal government, and urged the governors of surrounding states to respond with tents, cots, and other supplies. Cox sent Patterson, who basically was in charge of Dayton, a telegram outlining these and other measures. Cox had granted Patterson full authority to act for and on behalf of Dayton. By the end of the week, President Wilson's representatives arrived in Dayton. They stayed as guests in Patterson's Far Hills estate, enjoying the hospitality of a man the government had declared a felon. Patterson was in his element. He was working 16-hour days and organizing and directing everyone and everything. His efforts were sincere, though. The making of the boats, using his own materials, the sleeping accommodations, and meals for thousands, the fresh drinking water, paper cups, and malted milk were all paid for by NCR, with no reimbursement and no tax deduction available. By Thursday, the weather turned cold and the drizzle turned into a snowstorm, and the waters were receding, but what was found underneath them left a lot to be desired. Destroyed were 45,000 library books, $900,000 worth of warehouse tobacco, 1,500 pianos, and 1,400 horses. In Cincinnati, Charles Kettering talked the owners of the Aaron's Fox Company into lending him one of their fire trucks that they built. Kettering, who had never driven a truck before, drove the 7-ton vehicle back to Dayton, where its high-pressured hoses blasted Delco's equipment clean of mud. The death toll, 84 persons drowned and 13 died of exposure. Property loss, $67 million, which would be over $1 billion in today's dollars. Orville wrote to an associate, "My personal losses have been slight, somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000. He also said that the flood was probably the greatest calamity that has ever happened to an American city. The packing crate containing the 1903 airplane had been smeared with mud, but was still intact." Cox gave Patterson the rank of colonel, and the flood made John H. Patterson a national hero. President Woodrow Wilson was asked to give Patterson a presidential pardon. One editorialist wrote, "Mr. Patterson may technically be a convict, but at heart he is a man who loves his kind and whose conduct shames the spirit that cries but for his incarceration." Summoned to Dayton after the 1913 flood, Arthur Morgan would create the nation's first regional flood control system. Second to Patterson, Colonel Edward A. Deeds was the leading figure in the flood prevention effort. Morgan told the leaders of Dayton that flood control had to start with a full understanding of how a river system behaved. And to begin the process, the Flood Prevention Committee set out to raise $2 million in just 2 weeks. Patterson led the charge. Morgan called Patterson a peculiar combination of original genius and dictator. On the final day of the campaign, they came up $400,000 short. Patterson then personally summoned 500 Dayton men and women to a meeting, and with many theatrics, a plea to help achieve the city's security was announced, and in less than an hour, nearly $600,000 was raised. Flood control was now in the hands of the businessmen of Dayton and not the elected officials. This led to a new form of city government with a city manager who ran the daily affairs of the city. Morgan's flood solution was to build a dam with a hole in it, known by engineers as a dry dam. A dry dam is built with a permanent opening in its wall, with the opening sized to permanent passage of no more water than the river channel downstream can safely carry away. During a heavy rain, water would store in a basin behind the dam and then would dissipate once a storm passed. By August 1913, Morgan had drafted the plan, and the plan was pretty much illegal because Ohio had no provision to permit a multi-county flood control system or to establish a public agency to do the work. Morgan met with John McMahon, who drafted the legislation needed to proceed, and what came out of it was the Ohio Conservancy Act. Governor James Cox signed it into law on February 7, 1914. The plan was controversial, and Cox lost his governorship to Frank B. Willis by 30,000 votes out of 1.1 million cast. A few years later, Cox was back in Columbus, residing in the governor's mansion once again. Meanwhile, back in Dayton, John H. Patterson was free. The U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati overturned the conviction of Patterson and all on charges of criminal violation of the antitrust statutes. Flood rescue and relief had made Patterson a national hero. The judges were not eager to lock him in prison. The court, however, did order that the case be retried, although it never was. The federal courts also set aside the sentences of 24 NCR executives convicted with him. Over the next few months, Patterson fired every single one of them, deeds included. Patterson's only comment about the dismissals was that one of them got me into this mess. In 1914, U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that Orville's aviation patents were airtight, as no aircraft could get airborne without infringing on them. All who wish to fly must enter into a licensing agreement with Orville, pay royalties, or remain grounded. Orville had no drive to go beyond what the court was saying, and that was that two bicycle-building brothers in Dayton had given flight to the world. In 1915, Orville sold the Wright Company to a group of New York investors for $1.5 million. Back to Governor Cox. For the 1920 presidential election, Cox was nominated as Democratic presidential nominee. Franklin D. Roosevelt was his running mate. He ran for president on the following issues: endorsement of collective bargaining, development of inland waterways, attention to rural schools. Many thought this was too conservative a platform. Cox and the Democrats lost big. Nationally, Cox drew only 34% of the vote. They lost New York, the home state of Roosevelt, and they lost Ohio by 400,000 votes. He even lost Montgomery County. It is said that the better man lost the 1920 election. Warren G. Harding proved to be inept in office, perhaps corrupt, and then oblivious to corruption. Back to Cox. By all accounts, Cox never referred to the 1920 election or to his defeat in the contest. As his life ambition, who would speak of a defeat by Warren G. Harding? But Cox did not have it so bad. He had his newspapers. Cox never served in public office again, although many opportunities presented themselves. Instead, he built his empire. In 1939, he bought 2 newspapers in Atlanta and combined them into the Journal. In 1949, he created a monopoly in Dayton by buying his 2 rival newspapers, combining them and creating the Journal-Herald. Dayton columnist Raj Young once came across Cox muttering in the hallway about taxes. He stopped and said, "Do you realize I had to pay over $1 million in income taxes this year?" Raj said that she thought that if he was making enough money to owe that much in taxes, he didn't have anything to complain about. Kettering led GM not only in the automotive world, but beyond. Modern refrigerants and Frigidaire, the 2-cycle lightweight diesel locomotive engines. He was known as the best engineer in the nation. In 1933, he graced the cover of Time magazine, and the Saturday Evening Post ran a series about him. He never carried cash, and he never paid for lunch. That was always left up to his guest. He was a major benefactor of Antioch College, donating its library, its student union, and its science building. Kettering refused when it was offered to have the building named after him. Instead, a small framed portrait photograph hangs in the lobby over this statement. This is not a monument to anyone. This is a place to work. Today, the library is known as the Olive Kettering Library. Kettering retired from General Motors in 1947 at the age of 71. In the previous year, Olive Kettering had died of cancer. Aware of her disease and unable to do anything else, Charles joined with Alfred P. Sloan to create the Memorial Sloan Kettering Institute in Manhattan. Orville was not sentimental about things, and near the end of World War I, Orville directed that the Kitty Hawk gliders that were being stored in Dayton at a Dayton Wright hangar be taken out and burned. Ernest Dubel did the task, saying they were light and thin and didn't make much fire. On May 7th of 1922, John Patterson died of a heart attack at the age of 78 on the Pennsylvania Railroad on his way to Atlantic City. He had stepped down from direct management of NCR just a year before. And this is the gravesite of John Henry Patterson at Woodland Cemetery. James Cox died of heart failure at his home, Trails End, in 1957 at the age of 87. Cox was governor of Ohio at a critical time. He was candidate for presidency who, as everyone now agrees, should have won. Cox succeeded in everything except his central ambition in life, which was to become president. Charles Kettering died in 1958 at the age of 82. He remained active, conducting experiments of interest to himself and speaking on research and technology. He said it was not a disgrace to fail. He said that you had to learn to fail intelligently. Failing is one of the greatest arts in the world. One fails forward towards success. In late 1947, Orville, at the age of 76, headed to NCR headquarters for a meeting and had a mild heart attack as he was running up the stairs. 3 months later, a second heart attack killed him. These men changed the world with their inventions. They challenged the world with their minds. The world was theirs for the taking, yet each time they came back home and were the ones who made it great in Dayton. So I thank you.
Thank you, Angie. What a great presentation and the history behind all those people that were part of Dayton at the very beginnings. I think that is just tremendous. Thank you again.
Thank you.